I want to start by telling you a story, my story. The story begins with me being kind of stuck. As Betty Lou referred to, I've written several books. I wrote a whole series on the shift to the online, on-screen world, basically the world we're inhabiting today with our Zoom-based meeting. I tracked the widespread automation through the 80s. I've tracked the dumbing down of work, the deepening inequalities. I also was tracking the increasing sense of isolation people were feeling, and loneliness, and the sense of disconnection. Moreover, there was this disconnection setting in from the realities on the ground and the off-screen world. And these were the urgent realities of social breakdown and climate breakdown. But there I was stuck, because I knew I was part of the problem. I knew this in how driven my life continued to be, how much of a workaholic I continued to be, both online and offline. And then I had this sense of a need to go to Scotland, to search out my ancestral roots in the Highlands. I didn't know why, and I didn't know where I needed to go. So at first I had to just go on instinct. I kind of went wherever I felt the landscape might call to me. And there was something deeply familiar I found in the mist-based, mist-covered hills of the Highlands, in the austere and yet gentle lay of the land. When I took the exit onto a narrow secondary road into the Tay River Valley, I could feel myself getting excited, but also a little afraid. 2 glens off this valley were where my father's people had lived since, as far as I knew, before recorded time. They'd lived on commonly shared lands, first as hunter-gatherers, then as more settled hunter-gatherer, farmer, herders. But with the enclosure movement of the 1700s into the 1800s, the land had been enclosed, turned into private, exclusively private property. And my people, certainly on my father's mother's side, the Creers, were cleared off the land completely. It was called the enclosure. This had happened in the 1830s. So if it was some kind of homecoming I was hoping for when I went back there in 2011, 2012, I was a little late in the day. The rupture had been complete. Still, I had a shard of information from a Menzies family genealogy. My great-great-grandfather, James Menzies, was born in 1793 in a place called Tullicrow in the Glen Lyon. At the time, I didn't know that Tullicrow was the name of a common hamlet, or clachan as it was called. I didn't know where it was either because it didn't show up in the map. But luckily I happened upon an old farmer, and he pointed a bony finger in a certain direction. And next thing I knew, I was driving up a lane, my heart beating hard at the back of my throat as I came round the corner and came into view with the ruins of an old crux cottage. It had been built in 1791. James Menzies might have been born right here, I thought, as I wandered around, seeing its original river reed thatching under the sheets of tin that had been put on, taking in the enduring thickness of its walls. I walked the land of the fields beyond, noting the broken down stone fencing, the ruins of more cottages and some bothies, which are small sleeping huts. As I walked, sheep scattered or stared at me blankly. I stared back pretty well, just as blankly, because I really didn't know how to proceed. I might even have moved on, except that one of the bothies at Tullicrow had been restored, turned into an Airbnb, and I was in it. Still feeling lost, I decided to take responsibility for the weeds that were going to seed in what I imagined would have been the kale yard or kitchen garden on the south side of the abandoned Crux cottage. Maybe I should pause here just to clarify for some people who don't know what commons means, because lots of people confuse it with communism, where everything is state controlled and state owned. With the commons, it's all about individuals in relationship, specifically relationship with the land. So families had their own Crux cottages, their own kale yard for greens, and a byre at one end of the cottage where they kept their own cows, geese, ducks, hens, whatever. They had use rights to a field, a strip of field outside the main stone walls of the hamlet where they grew their grain. They had egg gathering rights in the local fens, wood gathering rights in the local forest, and then pasturing rights in the upland common pastures. All the work of maintaining the commons as a whole was done in shares as well, from maintaining the stone walls, digging ditches, keeping the pathways clear. The word common simply means together as one. The land and the people who inhabited it together as one. The commons was essentially constituted and reconstituted every day, season by season, year by year, by these practices. It was more of a verb than a noun. In fact, it was a phrase. Hommining, as people referred to it, was simply the way of life for these land-based people that were my ancestors, and possibly some of yours too. So there I was, in what it might have been James Menzies' mum's kale yard, trying to imagine my way back into that intimately land-based way of life. As I dug in the gritty dirt that constituted the soil here, bits of what I'd absorbed in my research and reading before I came on this trip came back to me. Quote, "The soil thin and gravelish," the local minister had written in one of his parish reports around the time that James Menzies was a boy. As I dug in the dirt, I thought, hasn't changed very much. As I continued pulling weeds and digging around, another phrase surfaced. Quote, "A field in good heart." I sat back on my heels, looked around as I turned that phrase over and over in my mind, savoring it for what it was telling me. That these people, my ancestors included perhaps, identified with these fields as alive, just as alive as they were, also with a beating heart. They understood too that sustaining that heartbeat was essential for sustaining theirs. A bit like Ubuntu, as we were saying at the beginning. Yes, and I'm sorry, I've forgotten her name. The woman who led us in that beautiful presentation, that beautiful service at the beginning. I am because you are. Well, it seems to be there in that phrase, a field of good heart, that close identification with the fields that sustain these people's lives. With the courage to go further, I decided I'd pack my day pack. I set out to find one of the upland common pastures where my ancestors took their sheep, cows, and goats for the summer, from Beltane to Lammas time on the old pagan calendar. And that's roughly from May to the end of August. These common pastures were sometimes called sheilings, but the word also referred to the stone fences and bothies and sheepfolds that these people constructed while they lived there through the summer. As I drove, once again, sheep scattered or stared at me blankly. I just smiled this time. And I thought of my ancestors coming this way themselves, carrying wool carding tools, sieves and presses for making cheese, tools for digging peat, and singing. Tradition bearers would lead the call and response incantation of songs like Chimi, which simply means I see. As they'd walk along, someone would call out some familiar piece of landscape they were passing through, and the tradition bearer would chant or tell the story behind whatever it was that they were passing by. And in doing this telling of the story, refresh memories of a richly inhabited homeland. In doing this person would renew the shared sense of storied connection to this landscape. A bit like reacquainting oneself with an old friend. One account I read said, the names of hills, glades, glens, corries, streams, even pools and rapids in a river, each had its own legend, which accounted for its origin and related some circumstance connected with it. It reminds me of the phrase kith and kin. Now we know what kin means, but I don't know how many people, I didn't until I looked it up the other day. Kith means several related things. One, the country or place that is known and familiar. Two, the persons who are known and familiar taken collectively. Three, sort of related to this, one's fellow country folk, neighbors, and acquaintances. And then another one, knowledge as acquaintance with something. Again, as I drove, the landscape seemed familiar, though increasingly I became aware of how silent it was, especially as I left my rental car in the back of a lay-by and started walking. I was following a footpath that I'd seen indicated on one of the large-scale ordnance maps that I'd bought. A path that would lead me, I was told, to the symbols that indicated the location of a Shilling's ruins. As I crested a ridge, a kestrel, I heard the shriek of a kestrel hovering overhead, over the entrance to this valley I was about to enter. Warning of an intruder or greeting me. It felt it could go either way, because while it felt good to walk into that valley toward the Shilling ruins at the far end, it wasn't easy wandering around these silent, long abandoned bothies and sheepfolds. I was aware of an inner resistance going on inside me, a sort of fear. I put my hand on the stones that my ancestors would have touched as they quarried them out of the stream bed, as they made repairs, as they rethatched the roofs, and as they lived here summer after summer until they couldn't, until they were forcibly gone. I couldn't enter because I was up against it, and I was aware of this. I was up against the point of disconnection, the disconnection of my family from the land of their ancestors, their homeland. The pain of it was there, the pain of the rupture. And at first, I couldn't take it on. I held back. But then the mist came tumbling down the hill. The wind got up, and it started to rain. And suddenly I found myself stepping right over that tumble down wall and hunkering down in the corner. As I sat there, munching on my deer sausage sandwich, staring off into the gray flannel emptiness, seeing nothing, hearing nothing, I remembered what an Ojibwe friend of mine in Ottawa, Bev, or Morning Star woman, what she told me when I was about to head off on that trip to Scotland. Oh, she said with a big smile, you're going to welcome your ancestors back. As I sat there in the enshrouding mist and all that silence, it was as though I could begin to believe the possibility of what she told me. I was letting them in, them being my ancestors. And in a way, I feel as though they've been with me ever since. When I returned to the Bothy at Tullicrow, I found myself leaning into the emptiness of what was no longer visible to me. I found myself listening to the silence for what it had to teach me. I heard a chaffinch sing out from the roof of the cottage and an answering song from close by. I smiled. They're still here. This is their territory too, I thought. Then I tried to imagine the myriad songs, chants, and incantations that would have filled the air when James Menzies was growing up here. Alexander Carmichael spent decades starting in the 1850s transcribing these songs out of the long oral traditions through which they'd been handed down generation to generation in the Highland culture. From what he preserved in his book, Carmina Gedelica, it's clear that people sang and chanted prayers all the time, invoking a blessing as they kindled the hearth fire in the morning or smoothed it down at the end of the day, as they prepared for their work of the day, as they went about it, and as they greeted each new dawn, the blessing of the rising sun gratefully received. The backstory of one such morning song that was told by somebody's descendant, this old woman, she would sing it every day as she was heading out to the back house or the outhouse. And as she explained to her child and then her grandchild, she said, if the birds can be out there singing their joy and praise at the dawning of a new day, why should we remain silent? I think there's a lot of wisdom in that. Carmichael quotes someone else telling him, whatever the people, whoops, I can see I'm getting my paper here. Didn't mean to be doing that. Haven't been looking at myself. I've been looking at my pages so that I can do as much looking at you or pretending you're there on the other side of my little dot rather than read from my thought notes. Carmichael quoted someone else telling him, whatever the people were doing, there would be a tune coming out of their mouths, whether they would be shaking corn in the kiln or feeding cows in the byre, fetching a stoop of water in, or bringing home a creel of peat. From each one's mouth would come their own croon. It might be that no person could be seen, but their voices could be heard up and around doing, here and there and everywhere. As I stood listening to the chaffinch's call and response, I thought of all the other singing, chanting voices that would have been heard here through all the seasons, through all the passage time of day, as they people worked alone or together, mowing grain and binding it into sheaves, gathering nettles and weaving them into rope, threshing grain, grinding it in stone querns. I imagined all those lines of single and shared singing, spinning and weaving an oral web of connection, round and about, uniting and binding these people together in this common clachan that was my ancestral home. Lest I romanticize, or perhaps I should say over-romanticize the comments, I should pause again here and point out that the commons like this one relied on solid local self-governance and associated surveillance, neighbor on neighbor. I just lost the page. As Eleanor Ostrom pointed out in her Nobel Prize awarding reading book, Governing the Commons, natural human greed and selfishness had to be curtailed. And it was by locally monitored and enforced rules, conformance with which, in turn, she argued, fostered mutual trust and mutual commitment to the common good. So when my ancestors drove their sheep, goats, and cows to the upland common pastures for the summer, they did so according to limits called stints on how many of each of these animals any one family could take. Moreover, there were either commons elected or commons appointed field constables who would impound animals that exceeded the allotted quota and levied fines that went into the common good fund to buy things like a new bull that could be used and shared in the community. Ostrom was awarded the Nobel Prize for Economics for the work like this that she did, restoring the importance and the reputation of the commons and of a commons-based economy. It is not entirely what you would call a transaction one, but still it did have its transactional elements. But I think what I want to point out here is that the utilitarian side, the political economy side, is only part of the story. There is this other cultural, spiritual side of cultivating community and the sense of mutual commitment to the common good. All the ceremonies and ritual practices accompanying all the actions and interactions that sustained everyday life on the commons. If nothing else, these ceremonies, rituals, singing, it ensured that none of it was taken for granted. And so I found myself standing in the gap on the north side of the Crux Cottage, the spot where the cow byre would have been. I remembered some lines from one of the milking songs Carmichael had gotten permission to write down, and I spoke them aloud into the space where my great-great-great-grandmother might once have sat herself, gentling some cow into giving her milk on yet another dreary morning, another dreary evening. Bless, O God, my little cow. Bless thou my partnership and the milking of my hands. Bless each teat. Bless each finger. I imagined the words of this prayer slipping like a glove over the fingers of my work-worn hands, enveloping the cow and me in that partnership, attuning us into a relationship out of which would come the gift of milk. And that milking becoming meaningful and perhaps even sacred because of that incantation. After milking, there would have been more singing, as this forebearer of mine, perhaps with little James Menzies beside her, took the cows out to the infield pasture for the day. Again, something from Carmichael's book comes to mind. His observation that, quote, the song is sung in slow and measured cadences, charming to hear. And it is interesting to see the measured tread of the older cattle keeping time with the well-known music. Or was it the other way around? I found myself wondering as I myself wandered around in that field out just beyond the Tullochrow walls. Perhaps these humans were adjusting their singing to the cadences, the footfalls of these older cows. Or perhaps it was a bit of both. We think of a sacred landscape as something with suggestively sacred constructions on it. And there are lots of those. But the sacredness can also be invoked, it seems to me, by this kind of simple act and song. In the mutual respect and attunement it suggests between human and more than human being. And the land itself, I think, as I recall, phrases like "a feeling good heart" and songs like "Chimi," with its call and response to familiar features of a richly inhabited habitat. The attunement to that and the honoring of a deep connection. The manifestation of the Spirit. I could go on and talk more about the everyday faith practices, such as the Celtic Christian veneration of water springs and wells as sacred. In fact, I discovered one at the foot of a cliff just out above Tullicrow called St. David's Well. It's named after a local minister called David Menzies, who lived in the mid-1400s and studied at a Celtic Christian monastery. I could also share some of the Celtic Christian interpretations of Jesus as, for instance, one prayer that's been handed down, the salmon in the well of mercy. The salmon, fish, in the well of mercy. And its interpretation of sin as leprosy of the soul. Leprosy's telltale loss of sensitivity in the skin becomes a fit metaphor for loss of empathy. That inclination to turn away, as Jesus seemed to suggest this was what sin meant in his teachings, particularly the Good Samaritan. The tradition of the Anam Cara, soul friend or quasi-elder, has also intrigued me, as have the role of these parables people carried around, and because they were so short and oral, people could just talk about them at any time. And by the way, at Cayley's, parables, scripture readings, this was a major part of a Cayley gathering, not just the music, not just the singing and dancing. Yeah, I've got a couple of parables that I brought along. Two of my favorites. Despite the shape of the peat, you can find a place in the stack for it. And a person by themselves is not a person. I could go on and on, but again, I've gone off track. And I want to stay true to this being a personal journey. Back in time and space as a personal journey and a personal experience that opened me up to a new perspective. Before I start talking about what I've learned from all that, I just want to take a moment to just stress the importance of the journey itself. Call it a pilgrimage to a place of origin, the place and time where my ancestors lived in direct relation with the earth before that connection was severed or lost. The journey certainly has shifted my perspective or refreshed it. For one thing, it's made me appreciate the legacy of the early Christian church. According to some recently published studies on this that are focused on the early Byzantium, and I'm referring to a couple of books that were reviewed in the New York Review of Books recently, quote, "What mattered most in those first centuries was that heaven and earth should stay connected." Fittingly, early Christian art was full of paradise imagery, yet recognizably as of the earth. Trees, flowing rivers, pastoral peace, they were everywhere in the imagery. As Rita Nakashima Brock and Rebecca Ann Parker write in their paradigm-shifting book, Saving Paradise, How Christianity Traded Love of This World for Crucifixion and Empire, quote, "In the early church, paradise, first and foremost, was this world, permeated and blessed by the Spirit of God. Again, that manifestation of the Spirit. And another quote, paradise was described in terms recognizably as earthly life at its best. It flourished when people took responsibility for the well-being of all and respected and protected the great cycles of life that sustained human life, to which I'd say all life. And later, the early church taught that paradise was a place, a way of life, even an ecosystem. They coined the term ethical grace to suggest what this way of life entailed, namely that, quote, the idea of paradise carries both the grace of the core goodness of life on earth and humanity's responsibility for sustaining it. To many, Jesus modeled this way of living in his teachings, particularly as he in those I am statements that are in the John Gospel. I am the Good Shepherd. I am the way. I am the bread. I am the vine. As in, identify with me there, there, and there. In the writings of 4th century Syrian poet and teacher Ephraim, Jesus was likened to a tree, even the tree of life. Again, I've kind of gone off on a tangent, one of those intellectual tangents that I'm very bad at. And I want to return to my own storied journey, my own narrative lines, even song lines, having taken me back to this place of connection to the earth, to this pre-modern commons. I return to the field near Tullicrow. I wander around the many standing stones, the stone circles in the vicinity, thinking of all the things I've read and learned, yet wanting to be fully present here. I walk closer to the standing stones, taking in their presence. I'm unable to read their meaning, but I'm content just to be there with them, letting their presence be with me. They mark this space as an inhabited place, a place where my ancestors drew sustenance and meaning from their relations with this land and honored those relations as sacred. Suddenly, a breakthrough. Commons as creation, or creation as a commons, I thought. It seemed as though I had gained a new perspective, standing there in the land of my ancestors, bringing the legacy of the commons, their commoning way of life, together with Celtic Christianity or early Christianity as it's been preserved there. One that includes not only the earth as sacred habitat, but all the inhabitants and all the interrelationships between them, or rather becoming sacred, moving towards the sacred as these inhabitants faithfully pursue their commoning practices day by day. The shared responsibility, the reciprocity, the mutual attunement, the mutuality of fellow feeling with more than human beings, as well as with other human beings. As I reflect on these, they seem to be in keeping with what some of the theologians I've read talk about. I think of Ivan Illich and his insistence on the incarnational, the spiritual combined with the fleshy, bodily, carnal, dense experience of self and the other. Then there's eco-theologist Sally McFaig, who writes about an incarnational theology, the immanence of God in the world, the centrality of relationships. God, she writes, is the most radically relational thou. There are so many things to reflect on if we dare to consider creation as a commons and to let ourselves use commons and a commoning way of life as a way to refresh our thinking about everything, really, but particularly, I would imagine, here in this context, the way of refreshing the thinking about the work you're involved in, liturgy and faith practices, mission, pastoral work. In the short break you'll have after I finish the talk, I encourage you to just sit there with everything you've seen and heard. And if it's moved you at all, let it move you, let it keep moving through you. And just let whatever surface, and you can always note it in the chat box. After that, you'll be joining the discussion groups. At the risk of prejudicing your own choices of what you want to talk about, I want to end with some things I flagged for further reflection myself. One is what I've already mentioned, the possibilities of bringing together the legacy of commons practices with the legacy of early Christianity. What's inspiring for me, anyway, is how the commons introduces an historical context that grounds the sacred. In the commons, the sacred is embedded in the routines of everyday life, and it shines through them in the ceremonies and the singing that accompany those daily routines, those seasonal routines and work actions. Within this discussion, some might want to use the commons cultural legacy as a way to rethink ceremony and ritual, including singing. And specifically, I'm thinking about its role as a medium for promoting mutuality, attuned mutual attention and engagement. For those who want to maintain a more personal tone, I think there's scope here to bring new thinking to identity politics, as the commons historical legacy invites you to shift the perspective from focusing on the individual self to self in relationship. Self in relationship, including with not only others, but other than human, more than human others, like cows and whales and trees and salmon. Again, for those wanting to keep things more personal, specifically focused on stories such as what I've shared, you might want to at least explore the possibility of, when you are back with your home congregations, you create some storytelling opportunities in which people can share their origin stories, how they came to be in North America. There might come from this stories of long ago connection to the earth somewhere else in the earth. It also might be an opportunity for people to break silence on possible traumas of disconnection and dislocation, as their families who'd had some continuity in place were forced to break those off. The connections were severed. I chose to share some of my story because for me, it's almost like a healing. It's almost like narrative therapy. I was healing, I think, an inherited memory of disconnection that I didn't even know had affected me, but I suspect has had a lot to do with my being what I call a recovering workaholic. Finally, there's another theme that I hope is run like an invisible thread through my talk, that of decolonization. To genuinely address the linked crises of social and environmental climate breakdown that I mentioned at the beginning, I think requires decolonization. And I understand this to be a societal transformation, but operating on a personal as well as an institutional level. I consider myself to be on such a journey, and it is a healing journey. As I deconstruct the colonized and colonizing thinking that continues to operate at the back of my mind, and as I open myself to alternatives that increasingly have been inspired as I reconnect with my pre-colonial heritage in the Highlands of Scotland, particularly around the Commons. As I do this, it hopefully prepares me to walk beside and in solidarity with the First Nations of this land as they assert and reassert their traditions and their ancestral relations to this land. I hope it also prepares me to contribute to the work that we non-Indigenous people must do to decolonize institutions like the United Church. But that's a whole different topic for another time. I've said plenty. I've probably gone over my time, and if I have, I apologize. I want to now turn things back to Susie.